Nora Whitfield's hands were shaking before her boots even touched Wyoming soil. She stared at the man standing beside the wagon, weathered silent, nothing like the tender words that had filled 100 letters, and one thought tore through her louder than the train whistle behind her. I married a stranger, and I don't even know his heart. She turned to run back up the steps. The conductor was already closing the door. If you're watching this from Ohio, from Georgia, from a little town nobody's ever heard of, tell me where you're watching from down in the comments. I want to see how far Nora and Silas's story travels tonight. And if this is your first time here, subscribe now, because you are not going to want to miss where this one goes. Stay with me all the way to the end. Now let's begin. The bride who wanted to run. The whistle screamed one last time behind her, and Nora Whitfield stood frozen on the platform, with her gloved hand still gripping the rail of the train she had just stepped off. She did not let go. Dust rose around her boots. The wind carried the smell of pine and cattle, and something dry and unfamiliar that made her stomach turn. She had crossed 1,100 miles of country to reach this platform, and now that she had arrived, every instinct in her body told her to climb back up those steps and beg the conductor to take her home. Because the man standing by the wagon was not the man she had married. She had never seen his face. Not once in a year of letters. She had married Silas Kane by proxy, her own cousin standing in his place before a judge in Boston, because that was how it was done when a man could not leave his land and a woman could not wait forever. She had signed the papers with a trembling hand and told herself that love could grow from words on a page, that a man's heart could be known through his handwriting. She had believed the letters, every line of them. The mountains here turn gold in the evening. Miss Whitfield and I confess I have thought more than once how fine it would be to have someone to share the sight with. I am not a man of much conversation, but I hope in time you'll find my silence is not coldness, only a man who thinks before he speaks. I will treat you with more gentleness than you have known, ma'am. That much I can promise, even if I cannot promise poetry. She had read that last line so many times the ink had begun to blur at the edges. And now the man those words belonged to stood 20 feet away from her, and he looked nothing like gentleness. He looked like the mountains themselves, hard, silent, unmoved by wind or weather. A leather vest cracked at the shoulders, a hat pulled low enough to shadow eyes she could not read. Hands resting loose at his sides, but scarred, thick-knuckled, a rancher's hands, not a poet's. He did not smile. He did not step forward. He simply watched her the way a man watches a storm cloud on the horizon, waiting to see which way it would break. Nora's fingers tightened on the rail. "Ma'am." His voice was low, rough at the edges, like it hadn't been used for anything gentle in a long while. "You get off the train, or you fixing to ride her back the way you came?" The question struck her harder than she expected, because for one long, humiliating second, she did not have an answer. She let go of the rail. Her boots hit the platform, and dust rose around the hem of her traveling dress, and she made herself walk toward him, even though her whole body wanted to run the opposite direction. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough now to see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the sun-darkened skin, the faint white scar along his jaw that no letter had ever mentioned. "Mr. Kane." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Ma'am." He tipped his hat just barely. "Reckon I ought to say welcome. Don't much feel like the right word seeing your face." "What do you mean by that?" "Mean you look like a woman who just realized she made a mistake." The bluntness of it stole her breath. She opened her mouth to deny it, to say something proper, something a lady from Boston would say, but nothing came. Because he was right. God help her, he was right, and they both knew it. And there was no letter she could have written that would have prepared her for the shame of being seen through so easily by a man she'd never met. "I don't know what I expected," she admitted, because lying felt suddenly impossible in front of him. "Not this." "Figured as much." He turned toward the wagon, and something in his shoulders looked heavier than it had a moment before. "Letters got a way of making a man sound finer than he is." "I didn't say that." "Didn't have to, ma'am." He picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing at all, and set it in the wagon bed without another word. Nora stood there feeling the eyes of the town on her. And there were eyes, she could feel them from the general store, from the porch of the boarding house, from a cluster of women near the well, who had stopped their conversation entirely to watch the mail-order bride arrive. She heard one of them murmur something to another, and though she couldn't make out the words, she understood the tone well enough. Pity. Amusement. The particular cruelty of small towns watching a stranger's humiliation unfold in real time. "Mrs. Kane, is it?" A new voice, smooth as poured honey, cut through the murmuring. Nora turned to find a man crossing the street toward her, tall, clean-shaven, dressed finer than anyone else she'd seen since stepping off the train. His coat was tailored. His boots had no dust on them at all, which struck her as strange in a town made entirely of dust. Barnaby Sloane. He removed his hat with a flourish and offered a bow just shy of mocking. "I own the land office here, and a good deal of the town besides. Welcome to the territory, ma'am. I confess, we don't get many brides as fine as you out this far." "Thank you, Mr. Sloane." "Sloane." Silas's voice flat and cold from beside the wagon. "Kane." Sloane's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "Didn't expect your bride to actually come. Man, in your position, I'd have thought a wife might be more trouble than she's worth." "That's so. All that paperwork on your claim." Sloane's gaze flicked to Nora, deliberate testing. "A man needs a resident wife to hold a homestead past the 5-year mark, doesn't he?" Convenient timing, her arriving now. Very convenient. Nora felt something shift in the air between the two men. Something old and sharp that had nothing to do with her, though it seemed she'd just been made a part of it. "You got business here, Sloane, or you just like the sound of your own voice? Just being neighborly?" Sloane's smile widened. "Ma'am, if things don't work out the way you hoped, and I've seen it happen more than once, brides coming out here full of romantic notions, and finding the reality don't suit, my office is always open. I'd hate to see a woman of your evident quality stranded out here on account of a bad match." "I have not been married a full hour, Mr. Sloane," Nora said more sharply than she intended. "I hardly think it's time to discuss failure." Something flickered in Sloane's expression. Surprise, maybe that she'd bitten back at all. Then the smile returned smoother than before. "Of course. Forgive me. A pleasure, Mrs. Kane." He replaced his hat and walked on unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world and knew exactly how he intended to spend it. Silas watched him go with his jaw tight enough that a muscle jumped along it. "What was that about?" Nora asked. "Nothing you need worry on. He mentioned my presence being tied to your claim. That sounds like something I should worry on." Silas looked at her, then really looked for the first time since she'd stepped off the train. "You always this direct, ma'am?" "I crossed 1,100 miles to marry a man I'd never seen based on the strength of his letters. I think directness is the least I'm owed at this point." Something almost like respect crossed his face before he shuddered it again. "Get in the wagon. Long ride yet before dark, and I'd rather not do the last of it in the black." The ride out of town was quiet enough that Nora could hear her own heartbeat. She sat as far from him on the bench as the space allowed, her hands folded tight in her lap, watching the town shrink behind them and the wilderness rise up ahead, endless and green and utterly unlike anything Boston had ever shown her. She should have found it beautiful. Instead, she found it terrifying, the way a person finds the ocean terrifying right before they realize they cannot swim. "You gonna sit like that the whole ride?" Silas asked, eyes on the road. "Like what?" "Like you're bracing for me to do something." "I don't know what to expect from you, Mr. Kane. That is rather the trouble." He was quiet a long moment. The wagon wheels creaked. Somewhere off in the trees, a bird called out something sharp and lonesome. "You wrote them letters?" he said finally. "Or somebody wrote them for you?" The question was strange enough that Nora turned to look at him directly. "I wrote every word myself." "Why would you ask such a thing?" "Because I didn't." His jaw worked. "Not all of it." The wagon rocked over a rut in the road, and Nora had to grip the bench to keep from sliding into him. When she'd righted herself, she found she couldn't look away from his profile. "What do you mean you didn't write it?" "Means what I said." His voice had gone rougher, like the words cost him something. I could hear and mend a fence and keep a herd alive through winter that'd kill most men. Never had much schooling. Never had much cause for pretty words neither, not till my sister-in-law took it on herself to help me get them down proper. Hannah's got away with a pen I never had. Nora's chest went tight and cold, like something had reached in and squeezed. So the man I fell in love with through those letters was still me. He said it fast, almost defensive. Every thought was mine. She just knew how to say what I couldn't figure how to spell out. That's all. That's all. Nora heard her own voice climb thin and sharp. Mr. Kane, I built a picture in my mind of a man for an entire year. I trusted every word of it. And you're telling me now that the very voice I fell for wasn't fully your own. I'm telling you the truth, same as I aim to keep doing whether you like the sound of it or not. How very noble of you, she snapped, and immediately hated herself for the venom in it, but she couldn't stop now that it had started. Do you have any notion what it is to cross a continent for a man's words, only to discover the words were half borrowed? Do you have any notion, Silas said, and for the first time his voice cracked loud enough to startle her, what it is to bury a wife and a boy, both in the same winter, and not have one word left in you worth saying to anybody, and have your sister-in-law sit down across from you with a pen because she couldn't stand to watch you die alone up here the way you decided to? The wagon went silent, except for the wheels and the wind. Nora stared at him. All the anger drained out of her, at once replaced by something worse. A cold, sick understanding of exactly how little she knew this man, and how much she had judged him for silence, that hadn't been coldness at all, but grief, with nowhere left to go. I didn't know, she said quietly. No reason you should have. Wasn't in the letters. Hannah thought it best I not lead with a dead wife and dead boy when courting a new one. His hands tightened on the reins. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe you had a right to know what kind of man you were marrying before you signed those papers. Mr. Kane. Silas is fine. Silas. She said it carefully, testing the shape of it. I am sorry. For your loss. And for what I said. He didn't answer right away. The road curved up through a stand of pine, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone flat and guarded once more. The door she'd glimpsed for one moment now closed tight. Ranch is another hour out. You'll want to rest when we get there. Long day for you, I expect. She understood the conversation was over. She let it be because she didn't yet have the right to push further, and because some small, stubborn part of her, the part that had read 100 letters and loved the man in them, wanted very badly to earn that right. The ranch, when it finally came into view, was smaller than she'd imagined, and rougher besides. A modest cabin. A barn that had clearly seen better repair. Fences that ran crooked in places where the wood had warped and never been fixed. It was nothing like the letters had painted it. No golden evening light, no picture of prosperity. Only the honest poverty of a man working a hard claim alone. An old man came out onto the porch as they pulled up, wiping his hands on a rag, squinting at Nora with open curiosity. This the bride, then, he called. Amos, this is Mrs. Kane, Silas said, climbing down. Nora, this is Amos Pruitt. Worked this land longer than I have. Wouldn't have made it through more than one winter without him. Ma'am? Amos tipped a hat gone soft with age. Heard a great deal about you. Well, heard a great deal about the letters anyhow. Didn't know if the woman writing back was half as fine as the words made her sound. I'm afraid I've already disappointed everyone's expectations tonight, Mr. Pruitt. Nora said, more tired than bitter now. Ma'am, out here, expectations are the first thing the land takes from a person. You'll do fine without 'em. Amos's eyes crinkled with something kind. Come on in. Got supper near ready, and you look like a woman who's had a long day of finding things out. She followed him inside, and Silas came behind carrying her trunk. And for a moment, just a moment, Nora let herself imagine what it might be like to belong somewhere like this. Then she remembered Sloane's smooth voice in the street, the way his eyes had measured her like a man appraising land he intended to own, and the warmth of the moment curdled into something wary. She would need to understand what that man wanted. Because whatever it was, she had the distinct and uncomfortable sense that her marriage, real or not, chosen or not, had already been drawn into the middle of it. Dog. Supper was quiet. Amos carried most of the conversation, filling silences that would otherwise have stretched too long between Nora and Silas, telling stories about the ranch, about the cattle, about a winter 3 years back that had nearly finished them both. Nora watched Silas throughout it, the way he ate without extravagance, the way his eyes softened only when Amos spoke of the boy just once in passing, and then went carefully blank again. She thought of the letters, of Hannah's hand shaping his grief into something a stranger in Boston could read and fall for. She did not know yet whether to be angry about it or grateful. Perhaps both. Perhaps that was simply what marrying a stranger meant, learning to hold two feelings at once, and not choose between them too quickly. After supper, Amos excused himself to the bunkhouse, and Silas showed her to the single bedroom without a word, informing her he'd take the barn loft for as long as she needed to feel easy about the arrangement. It was, she thought, a kindness she hadn't expected. She said as much. "Didn't marry you to frighten you, ma'am," he said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looking younger and more uncertain than he had all day. "Whatever else I am, I ain't that. Nora," she said. "You may call me Nora." Something shifted in his face, small but real. "Nora, then. Get some rest. Tomorrow will come whether you're ready for it or not." He left her alone in the dark, and she lay awake a long while listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night, turning over everything the day had given her: the shock of his face, the sting of his honesty, the terrible tenderness of his grief, the oil-smooth threat behind Barnaby Sloane's smile. She did not know yet if she had made a mistake. But she knew, lying there in a stranger's house at the edge of the wilderness, that she was no longer certain she wanted to leave before she found out. She woke before dawn to the sound of raised voices outside. Nora sat up fast, heart-hammering, and crossed to the window in time to see Amos standing in the yard, arguing with a figure she recognized immediately, even in the gray half-light, Sloane dressed for riding, this time a folded paper in his gloved hand. "Filed weeks ago," Sloane was saying, his honeyed tone gone hard at the edges. "You can tell Kane the surveyor's coming Thursday whether he likes it or not. Boundary's in question, and I intend to see it settled." "Boundary ain't in question to anybody but you, Sloane," Amos snapped back. "That water's run through Kane land since before you ever set foot in this territory. Times change, old man." Sloane's eyes lifted, and for one unsettling second, Nora was certain he'd seen her at the window, though his expression gave nothing away. So do the men who hold the deeds. He turned his horse and rode off before Amos could answer, leaving the old man standing in the yard, with his fists clenched and his breath coming hard. Nora's hand pressed flat against the cold glass. Whatever Barnaby Sloane wanted from this land, she understood now with a cold certainty settling low in her chest. He did not intend to wait patiently for it. And she had arrived quite unknowingly in the middle of a fight that had been building long before she'd ever boarded a train in Boston. She dressed quickly. Whatever kind of marriage this was, whatever kind of man Silas Kane truly turned out to be, beneath his silence and his sorrow, she was his wife now. And she found standing in that unfamiliar room with the mountain light just beginning to break gray and gold over the ridgeline that some stubborn, unexpected part of her had already decided she was not getting back on that train. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly what Barnaby Sloane wanted and exactly what it would cost the man whose grief she had unknowingly fallen in love with one borrowed word at a time. Nora was still standing at the window when Silas's boots sounded on the porch steps below. She watched him cross the yard to where Amos stood, watched the old man's hands moving fast and sharp as he relayed whatever had passed between him and Sloane. She couldn't hear the words from up here, but she didn't need to. She could read it in the set of Silas's shoulders, the way they went rigid, then dropped like a man absorbing a blow he'd been expecting for a long while and was tired of bracing for. By the time she made it downstairs dressed and steady, both men had gone quiet. "Morning," Silas said. Nothing in his face gave away what she'd witnessed. "I saw him," Nora said. No sense pretending otherwise. Sloane. In the yard before dawn. Silas's jaw tightened. Amos tell you what? I didn't need telling. I heard enough. She folded her hands in front of her, steadying them. He mentioned a survey, Thursday, a boundary dispute. Boundary. There ain't no dispute. Amos cut in bitter. Not a real one. That water's run Kane land since before Sloane's daddy ever bought into this territory. Then why does he believe he can contest it? Silas was quiet a moment too long. Because he's got money enough to make the county believe whatever he tells them to believe, he said finally. And I ain't got money enough to fight it. Hannah arrived before noon, driving her own wagon with a boy of 6 perched beside her, and the moment she climbed down, Nora understood without a word being said exactly who this woman was to Silas, and exactly how much courage it must have taken her to sit down across from a grieving man with a pen in her hand and pull the words out of him one aching sentence at a time. Atabeye. You must be Nora. Hannah's eyes were kind but sharp to assessing. I confess, I've been half sick with nerves wondering what you'd think of me. Think of you. For the letters. Hannah's chin lifted like she was bracing for judgment. Silas told you, I expect, about my hand in them. He did. And Nora considered her answer carefully. The boy, Hannah's son, she gathered, had already run off toward the barn, shrieking with delight at a barn cat that clearly wanted nothing to do with him. I was angry at first, Nora admitted. I felt as though I'd fallen in love with words that weren't entirely his own. Hannah's face fell. But I've had a night to think on it, Nora continued. And I've decided that a woman who sits with a grieving man until he finds enough of himself left to speak even second-hand is not a woman who deceived me. She's a woman who saved him enough that there was something left for me to meet at all. Hannah's eyes went bright and wet fast enough that she had to look away and busy her hands with the horse's harness. Lord, she said, voice thick. You're going to do just fine out here, Nora Kane. The ledgers were worse than Nora expected. She found them that afternoon while Silas and Amos were out mending the fence line Sloane had disputed, tucked in a battered tin box under a loose floorboard near the hearth Hannah had shown her, where, with a look on her face that said she'd been hoping someone capable would find them eventually. Columns that didn't total. Debts recorded twice. A payment to the county clerk's office that appeared nowhere in the receipts, though Nora was almost certain, cross-referencing dates against a letter Silas had once written about a hard winter, that the payment had actually been made. By the time Silas came in for supper, sweat-dark and exhausted, she had the ledgers spread across the table like evidence in a courtroom. What's this? He said. Not really a question. More like a man who already suspected the answer and didn't like it. Your books, Mr. Kane. They're a disaster. They're fine. They are not fine. You've paid the same debt twice in March and recorded a payment to the county that has no receipt to match it, which means either you were cheated or the clerk misfiled it, or... Nora. His voice had an edge now. I didn't ask you to go digging through my business. The words landed harder than she expected, and for a moment she felt the old shame rise up, the shame of a woman told to mind her place. But she thought of Sloane's smooth, patient smile in the street, and she thought of the survey coming Thursday, and something in her hardened, instead of retreating. Your business is about to determine whether you keep this land, she said. I trained under my father for 4 years before he passed Mr. Kane. I balanced ledgers for 2 shipping firms in Boston that would have gone under without me. I am not offering to meddle. I am offering the one skill I have that might actually be of use to you out here, and you are refusing it because your pride can't stomach a woman seeing where you've fallen short. Silence. Amos wisely found something urgent to attend to in the barn. Silas stood there with his hat still in his hand, and something moved behind his eyes, anger giving way slowly, grudgingly, to something closer to shame of his own. I never had schooling past 10 years old, he said finally, quiet. Ma died. Pa needed hands on the ranch more than he needed a boy who could read numbers. I do the best I can with what I know. I'm not saying you're a fool, Silas. I'm saying you're a man who's been carrying more than one person should carry alone, and you've had no one to hand the numbers to. Now you do. She held his gaze. "Let me help you." He looked at the ledgers a long moment. "Fine," he said, rough. "But you find something wrong, you bring it to me first. Not to Sloane, not to the town, me." "Agreed." Can. She found the discrepancy at nearly midnight, working by lamplight long after the house had gone quiet, and when she found it, her stomach dropped clean through the floor. The payment recorded to the county clerk, the one with no receipt, matched almost to the dollar, a deposit made the very same week into an account she recognized from a receipt tucked loose in the back pages. Barnaby Sloane's land office. She sat very still for a long moment, staring at the numbers, working through every possible innocent explanation, and finding none that satisfied her. Then she went and woke Silas. "Say that again," Silas said, standing in the barn loft doorway in his shirt sleeves, hair mussed with sleep, staring at her like she'd lost her mind for waking him at this hour. "Your payment to the county, the one that never got a receipt, the amount matches a deposit into Sloane's land office account almost exactly. I think your money never reached the county clerk at all, Silas. I think it went to Sloane." "That's a hell of an accusation." "It's an observation, backed by numbers. I'm not accusing him of anything I can't show you in black ink." Silas took the ledger from her hands and stared at it like the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less damning if he looked hard enough. "If that's true," he said slowly, "it means Sloane's had a man inside the clerk's office diverting payments for God knows how long, which means the county thinks I'm behind on taxes I already paid, which is exactly the kind of technicality a man could use to contest a boundary claim," Nora said, "or force a foreclosure." Silas's face went white, then hard as stone. "Thursday," he said. "The survey. I think Thursday is the day he intends to prove you're not current on your obligations. And if the county believes that, they side with him." Silas closed the ledger with a sharp snap. "Son of a bitch has been robbing me blind for 2 years and smiling at me in the street the whole while." The next morning, Nora insisted on riding into town with him. "This isn't your fight," Silas said, saddling his horse with more force than necessary. "I married into this family, Mr. Kane. Which means whether either of us intended it or not, it became my fight the moment I stepped off that train." He looked at her a long moment, really looked the way he had that first night in the wagon, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, even through the anger. "Get your coat," he said. "Cold this morning." The county clerk's office smelled of dust and old paper, and the man behind the counter, a nervous, narrow fellow named Pruitt, no relation to Amos, went pale the moment Silas laid the ledger open on the counter. "I want to see the receipt book," Silas said. "March, every payment logged that month." "Mr. Kane, I don't know that I'm authorized to—" "You're authorized to show a taxpayer his own record, Pruitt, or I'll fetch the county judge myself, and we'll discuss what you're authorized to do." Pruitt's hands shook as he pulled the book from the shelf. The March page, when he finally found it, had a payment recorded but not from Silas. From a different name entirely on the same date for an amount close enough to be a coincidence if Nora hadn't spent 4 years of her life learning that coincidences rarely balanced so precisely. "That's not my payment," Silas said, low and dangerous. "That's my money with somebody else's name stamped over it. Mr. Kane, I assure you, I only file what's brought to me. I don't—" "Who brings you the entries for the land office accounts, Pruitt?" Nora asked, gentle as she could manage while her pulse hammered. "Whose hand delivers Mr. Sloane's paperwork?" Pruitt's eyes flicked toward the door, like he half expected Sloane to be standing there listening. "I can't say, ma'am." "Can't or won't?" He said nothing, which was in its own way an answer. Like, they found Sloane outside the Mercantile holding court with 2 other men in fine coats, laughing at something Nora couldn't hear. His smile widened the moment he spotted them crossing the street. "Kane, Mrs. Kane." He tipped his hat, easy, unbothered. "Don't tell me you're here about Thursday's survey. I do hope you're not planning to make a scene." "I'm here about a payment," Silas said. "That went missing from my account and turned up in your books. Sloane's expression didn't so much as flicker. "That's a serious accusation, Kane. It's a fact I can show you in ink. A great many things if a man's desperate enough to make it say them." Sloane's gaze slid to Nora, and something about the way he looked at her, assessing patient, almost pitying, made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Kane, I did warn you, didn't I? Marriages built on desperation rarely hold up under pressure. I'd hate to see you caught in the wreckage of whatever it is your husband thinks he's found." "My husband has found a discrepancy that the county clerk himself couldn't explain," Nora said, keeping her voice level, though her hands wanted to shake. "I imagine a judge would find that quite interesting." Something shifted behind Sloane's eyes. Not fear, not yet, but a recalculation. "You're a bold woman," he said. "I'll give you that. I'm an accountant's daughter, Mr. Sloane. Numbers don't intimidate me. I find I'm rather good at making them tell the truth whether the men behind them want them to or not." For one long moment the street seemed to hold its breath. Then Sloane laughed, a short, sharp sound with no warmth in it at all. "Thursday," he said. "The survey happens as scheduled. If your books are as clean as you claim, Kane, you've nothing to fear from it." He walked away unhurried as ever, and Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That went about as well as I feared," Silas muttered. "He's rattled," Nora said. "Men like that don't laugh unless they're trying to convince themselves they're still winning." That night over supper, Silas told her about Mary. It came out slow, unprompted, the way confessions often do when a man has spent too long holding them in silence and finally finds someone patient enough to wait him out. "Sloane courted her first," he said, not looking up from his plate. "Before me, years back. She turned him down for me, and he never did let that go easy." Nora went very still. "You never mentioned that." "Wasn't sure it mattered anymore. She's gone 3 winters now." His hand tightened around his fork. "But I think on it different now, knowing what we found today. Man like Sloane don't forget a woman choosing another man over him. And now he's got a chance to take everything that man built instead. I expect that suits him just as well." "Silas." Nora reached across the table hesitant and laid her hand over his. "That's not your fault. None of it. Feels like it some nights. It isn't." She held his gaze steady. "You are not responsible for another man's bitterness, Silas Kane. You are only responsible for what you do about it now. And what we do about it now is make Thursday's survey the worst mistake Barnaby Sloane ever made." Something shifted in his face, gratitude maybe, or the first real flicker of trust, and for a moment neither of them moved their hands. Wednesday brought trouble of a different kind. Nora rode into town alone at Hannah's invitation for what Hannah had promised would be a pleasant afternoon among the local women, a chance she'd said to be welcomed properly away from the tension of the ranch. It was not pleasant. "Mrs. Kane," a woman named Louisa Fitch, greeted her with a smile sharp enough to cut. "How are you settling in? I hear the Kane place has seen better days. Must be quite the adjustment coming from Boston." "It's been an adjustment," Nora agreed evenly, "though I find the people prove more challenging than the accommodations." A ripple of laughter, uncertain whether it was meant to be shared or endured. "I only mean," Louisa continued undeterred, "that a woman raised to fine things might find it difficult married to a man who can't even keep his ledgers straight. I heard tell the county's questioning his tax payments." "Then you heard incorrectly," Nora said, cool as she could manage. "The county is questioning a payment diverted through fraud which my husband and I discovered and are actively correcting. I'd be careful repeating gossip you haven't verified, Mrs. Fitch. It tends to reflect rather poorly on the one repeating it, not the one it's aimed at." The smile on Louisa's face faltered just slightly. Hannah beside her pressed her lips together to hide a grin. "Well," Louisa said, recovering, "I suppose we'll see what Thursday brings." "Yes," Nora agreed. "I suppose we will." Thursday morning arrived, cold and gray mist still clinging low to the mountain ridge when the surveyor's wagon pulled into the yard. Sloane came with him, of course, dressed sharp expression, composed into something almost sympathetic, like a man arriving to witness a tragedy he'd had no hand in causing. "Mr. Kane, Mrs. Kane. He tipped his hat. Shall we begin? The surveyor, a thin, official-looking man named Hobbs, unrolled a map across the wagon bed, and Nora felt her stomach clench the moment she saw the boundary line marked in fresh red ink, cutting clean through the eastern pasture. Through the water. That's not the boundary, Silas said flat. That line's been the same since my father's father filed the original claim. According to the county's most recent survey, Hobbs said not unkindly, the boundary sits here. He tapped the red line. Filed and recorded 3 months ago. Filed by who? Hobbs checked his papers. A survey conducted at Mr. Sloane's request, cross-referencing older markers that had apparently shifted with erosion over the years. Shifted. Silas's voice had gone dangerously quiet. Convenient that they shifted directly onto my water. I only file what the county provides me, Mr. Kane, Hobbs said. I'm not here to adjudicate disputes. Nora stepped forward before Silas's temper could get the better of him. Mr. Hobbs, might I see the original markers referenced in that survey? The physical stakes, I mean, not the map. Hobbs blinked clearly, not expecting the question from her. Yes, ma'am, they should still be staked out along the line. Then let's walk it, Nora said. All of us, together. Sloane's easy composure flickered just barely, but enough that Nora caught it. I hardly think that's necessary, he said. Why not Mr. Sloane? Nora asked, sweet as poison. If the survey's accurate walking, it should only confirm what you've already claimed. There was nothing he could say to that without revealing exactly how much he didn't want them looking too closely, and he knew it. He forced a smile. By all means. They found the first stake half a mile out, hammered deep into fresh-turned earth that hadn't had time to settle the way 3-month-old ground should have. This dirt's disturbed, Silas said, crouching, running his fingers through it. Recent. Weeks, maybe. Not months. Erosion moves earth too, Mr. Kane, Sloane said, though his voice had lost some of its silk. Erosion don't leave a shovel mark. Silas said, holding up a fragment of metal caught in the dirt. The broken tip of a spade, rusted but unmistakable. This ain't natural shifting, Sloane. Somebody dug this stake up and moved it, recently, by hand. Hobbs' face had gone pale. Mr. Sloane, if this survey was falsified. It wasn't falsified. Sloane snapped, composure finally cracking. It was corrected. The old markers were imprecise to begin with. Imprecise enough to move directly onto the only water source on my land, Silas said. That's not correction, Sloane. That's theft with paperwork. Careful, Kane. Sloane's voice had gone cold now, all pretense of neighborliness gone. Accusations like that in front of a county official could see you brought up on charges of your own. Slander's a serious matter out here. So is fraud, Nora said, and forgery, and theft of tax payments diverted through a corrupted clerk's office. I imagine a judge would find quite a lot to discuss, Mr. Sloane, once we lay all of it before him. Shall we start with the deposit that matches my husband's missing March payment? Or shall we start with this stake? Sloane's jaw tightened. For the first time since she'd met him, Nora saw something crack behind his composure. Not quite fear, but the recognition of a man realizing the ground beneath his scheme had shifted every bit as much as the stakes he'd falsified. This isn't finished, he said low, meant for Silas alone, though Nora heard it clearly enough. No, Silas agreed. It ain't, but it's about to go a lot worse for you than you planned. Hobbs left that afternoon promising to file a formal report with the county judge, and Sloane rode off without another word, his back rigid, his silence far more unsettling than any threat he might have spoken aloud. That night, the ranch felt different. Lighter somehow, despite the danger clearly still circling them. Amos broke out a bottle he'd been saving for what he called an occasion worth celebrating. And even Silas allowed himself something close to a smile over supper. You did that, he said to Nora, quiet once Amos had gone off humming to the bunkhouse. Today. That was you. It was both of us. Wasn't me who thought to check the dirt on the stake. And it wasn't me who knew this land well enough to know that line was wrong the second he saw it, Nora said. We make a fair team, Mr. Kane. Silas. he corrected soft. Silas. She smiled and found she meant it fully for the first time since stepping off that train. But the peace didn't last. 2 nights later, Nora woke to the sound of cattle screaming. She was out of bed and down the stairs before she fully understood what was happening. Silas already ahead of her rifle in hand, Amos shouting from the yard. "Fire fence lines burning. Somebody's cut the herd loose through the break." The night sky glowed orange along the eastern ridge, the very fence line they'd fought so hard to defend, just days before flames licking up dry brush cattle stampeding through the gap in a panic that could scatter half their herd into the mountains by morning. "Sloan!" Silas snarled, already running for his horse. "Silas, wait!" Nora caught his arm. "If you ride out there half-mad with a rifle, you're playing exactly into whatever trap he set. Think. Please." He stared at her chest, heaving fury and fear, warring plain across his face. "That's my herd, Nora. Everything we got is in that herd. I know, and we're going to save what we can. But we do it smart, not fast." She grabbed a coat, already moving. "Amos, can you handle the North Gap alone?" "Reckon I can try." "Then Silas and I take the fire line. Water blankets, whatever we can beat it down with before it spreads further into the grass. Go." For one suspended second, Silas looked at her like he was seeing something entirely new. A woman who, faced with disaster, did not freeze, did not weep, did not wait to be told what to do. "Let's move," he said, and they ran together into the smoke and the screaming dark, the fire roaring ahead of them like a living, hungry thing. And somewhere out there in the chaos, cattle scattering toward the tree line, and a man who wanted them ruined. Watching perhaps from some safe and distant place, smiling at the blaze he'd almost certainly set with his own hand, and no proof left behind to hang him for it. The fire ate through dry brush faster than Nora had ever imagined fire could move, and by the time she and Silas reached the fence line, the eastern pasture had become a wall of orange light against the black mountain sky. "Blankets first!" Silas shouted over the roar already beating at the flames crawling along the fence rail. "Don't let it reach the grass past the break. You understand me. That grass goes up, it takes the whole slope with it." Nora didn't answer. She didn't have breath to spare. She swung the wet blanket Amos had thrust into her arms, down onto the flames again and again, her arms screaming, her eyes streaming from smoke. And somewhere in the chaos, she heard cattle bawling hooves, thundering past in the dark panic, driving the herd wherever their animal terror decided to take them. "Silas!" she screamed. "The gap they're running through the gap. Let them run." He didn't look up from the fire. "We can gather cattle come morning. We lose this fire line. We lose the whole ranch tonight." She understood distantly that he was right. That a scattered herd could be found again, walked back, counted, and recovered. A ranch burned to ash could not. They fought the fire for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than 40 minutes, side by side, choking on smoke, until finally the flames began to gutter and die along the fence line, beaten back into smoldering black scars in the earth. Nora dropped to her knees in the dirt, her whole body shaking, blanket still clutched in blistered hands. "You did good," Silas said, breathing hard beside her. Soot streaked across his face. "Real good for a woman who's never fought a range fire in her life." "I've fought worse in ballrooms," Nora managed, and something in his exhausted, filthy face cracked into the first real laugh she'd heard from him since she'd arrived. It didn't last. "Silas!" Amos's voice from somewhere behind them, tight with alarm. "You best come look at this." The wire was cut, not burned through cut. Clean, deliberate shears through fence wire that had held for 15 years without failing right at the weakest point in the line, right where a man on horseback could reach it easy in the dark without ever dismounting. "Somebody set this fire on purpose," Amos said, crouching by the cut wire with a lantern raised. "And they cut this line first so the herd would run the second the fire hit. Wanted your cattle scattered clean across the mountain, Silas. Wanted you spending days finding them instead of fighting Sloan in front of a judge." Silas's face, already dark with soot, went darker still with fury. "There's no proof it was him," Nora said quietly. though she didn't believe her own words, even as she spoke them. "Don't need proof to know it in my gut," Silas said. "Man tried to steal my water with a falsified survey 4 days ago. Now my fence is cut and my herd scattered across a mountain range in the dark. You tell me what other man in this territory's got a reason to see me ruined tonight." "Then we find the proof," Nora said, forcing steel into her voice because someone needed to keep a clear head, and it was plain neither man beside her currently could. "We don't ride off half-mad accusing a man with money enough to buy a judge's ear. We find the proof, and then we bury him with it." Silas looked at her a long moment in the lantern-light chest, still heaving from the fire, and something passed between them that was not quite agreement and not quite argument, something closer to trust, hard-won and still fragile. "Fine," he said. "But come morning, we're gathering that herd. Every last head we can find. I ain't losing my cattle on top of everything else that man's already taken from me." Dawn broke gray and merciless, and the work of gathering the scattered herd began before the light had even fully climbed the ridge. It was grueling bone-deep work riding the tree line, calling cattle down from brush and gully, counting heads against a tally that kept coming up short, no matter how many hours passed. By midday, they'd recovered most of the herd, but 11 head remained unaccounted for, and Silas's expression had gone grim in a way that worried Nora more than the fire had. 11 head, he said, staring out at the tree line like it might confess where the cattle had gone if he looked hard enough. "That's near enough to break us this close to winter stores." "We'll find them," Nora said. "Maybe. Maybe they wandered into a ravine and broke their necks in the dark. Maybe a mountain cat took one before sunup. Maybe they're standing not a half-mile off and we just ain't looked hard enough yet." He pulled his hat off, dragged a hand through sweat-damp hair. "Point is, I don't know. And not knowing's its own kind of misery." "Then let's go look harder," Nora said, already turning her horse. Amos had insisted she learn to ride properly her second week on the ranch, an insistence she was now deeply grateful for. "There's a stretch of pasture past the ridge we haven't checked. Steep, but not impossible." Silas hesitated. "That ground's treacherous, Nora. Loose rock, steep drop on the far side. Man could break a leg, easy horse and rider both if he ain't careful." "Then we'll be careful." "I don't like it." "Silas." She met his eyes steady. "I did not come 1,100 miles and survive a house fire 2 nights past to be told I can't help gather cattle on a hillside. Let me help." He studied her a long moment, something warring behind his eyes. Worry, respect, the particular frustration of a man who had learned in a short span of days that arguing with this woman rarely ended in his favor. "Fine," he said finally, "but you stay close. Ground gets bad past that first stand of pine you turn back. No arguing it. Promise me." "I promise." She did not entirely mean it. She would understand that later with a clarity that came far too late to matter. Yet, they found 7 of the missing head grazing calm as anything in a hollow past the ridge, and the relief of it loosened something tight in Silas's shoulders that Nora hadn't fully realized was there until she watched it ease. 4 more, he said, counting again to be certain. "Better than 11. We'll manage 4. "There's still daylight left," Nora said. "Let's push a little further before we turn back." "Nora?" Warning now plain in his voice. "This is where the ground turns bad. I told you. I remember what you told me." She was already urging her horse forward along a narrow game trail that wound up past the pine stand toward a rocky overlook. "I only want to see if I can spot them from higher ground. I won't go far." Nora. But she was already moving, and stubbornness. The same stubbornness that had put her on a train to marry a stranger. The same stubbornness that had made her demand a place in his ledgers, and his fight against Sloane carried her forward before caution could catch up. The trail narrowed faster than she expected, the rock beneath her horse's hooves loosening with every step, and by the time Nora understood how badly she heard Silas shouting her name. "I'm fine," she called back, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. I see something. There's movement past that outcrop. It was, in fact, 3 of the missing cattle grazing on a narrow shelf of grass below the overlook. Close enough of them flooded her with foolish premature triumph. She should have turned back the moment she spotted them. She should have ridden down to fetch Silas. Let him assess the ground with the eyes of a man who had worked this mountain his whole life. Instead, driven by something she would later recognize as pride dressed up as usefulness, she nudged her horse forward toward a narrow switchback that looked from where she sat entirely passable. The rock gave way on the 3rd step down. Her horse screamed a sound Nora would hear in her nightmares for months afterward, and reared hard against the sudden shift of ground beneath its hooves, and Nora felt herself pitched sideways weightless for one endless terrible second, before the world came up to meet her in a crash of pain and dust and the sickening crack of her own shoulder striking stone. She did not lose consciousness, though she would later wish she had, if only to have been spared the agony of the moments that followed, dragging herself upright with one arm hanging useless and wrong at her side, her horse nowhere in sight having bolted back up the trail without her. The light beginning already to shift toward evening in a way that made her chest go tight with dawning terror. "Silas?" Her voice cracked on his name. "Silas, I'm down here." No answer. Only wind and the distant, indifferent call of some mountain bird, and the growing, creeping cold that told her the sun was dropping faster than she had any right to expect. She tried to climb. Every attempt sent fire lancing through her shoulder, and twice she slid backward on loose scree, catching herself with her good arm, hard enough to tear skin from her palm. By the 3rd attempt, tears streaming freely down her face, not from pain alone, but from a rising, suffocating fear that no one would find her before the cold. Did she understood with brutal clarity exactly how badly she had misjudged this land, this mountain, her own capability against forces far larger than her pride had accounted for. The mountains don't care how capable you are. Silas's warning, days old, now rang through her mind with the particular cruelty of hindsight. "I'm sorry," she whispered to no one, to the mountain, to the man whose caution she had dismissed with her own stubborn certainty. "I'm sorry, I should have listened." The light kept dropping, and somewhere above her she could hear nothing at all. No hoofbeats, no voice calling her name, only the vast, indifferent silence of a wilderness that had swallowed better and more careful people than her without a second thought. Silas found the riderless horse first. He would tell her later, much later, once the worst of it had passed, that the sight of that empty saddle had done something to him. He did not have words for, not even borrowed ones, not even with Hannah's careful hand to help him find them. That the world had gone white and roaring for one endless second, and then narrow and sharp and focused, every instinct he'd spent a lifetime building on this mountain, rising up at once to meet the only emergency that had ever truly terrified him. Nora. He was off his own horse before it had fully stopped scanning the ground. The broken scree, the drag marks where a horse had scrambled and panicked and bolted without its rider. Nora. Nothing. He forced himself to think. To read the ground the way his father had taught him, the way 10 years of solitary ranching had honed into instinct sharper than most men ever developed. The horse had come from the switchback trail, the treacherous one, the one he'd warned her away from not an hour past. Loose rock recently disturbed. A boot scuff at the edge of the drop, half erased by sliding scree. She'd gone over, or tried to climb down. Either way, she was below somewhere on that unforgiving slope, and the light was dying fast, and the temperature would drop hard and mean once the sun fully dropped behind the western ridge. Nora. Answer me if you can hear me. And then, faint, thin, nearly lost beneath the wind, Silas. His chest cracked open with relief so violent it nearly buckled his knees. "I'm coming," he shouted. "Stay put, you hear me. Don't move. Don't try to climb. I am coming to you right now." Minged. The descent was the hardest thing Silas Kane had ever done, and he had buried a wife and a son in the same brutal winter, so that was no small measure. Every foothold felt like a gamble. Every loose stone sent his heart into his throat. But he did not slow, did not hesitate, driven by something that had stopped being caution the moment he'd seen that empty saddle and become instead a single focused animal, need to reach her before the mountain finished what it had started. He found her huddled against an outcrop, one arm cradled useless against her chest, her face streaked with dirt and tears, and dried blood from a cut along her hairline, shivering hard enough that her teeth chattered audibly even over the wind. "Silas." Her voice broke entirely on his name relief and shame, tangled together so thick she could barely speak through it. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have turned back when you told me." "Don't." He was already beside her, hands moving fast and sure over her, checking the shoulder, wincing at what he found, shrugging out of his own coat to wrap around her shaking frame before she could protest. "Don't you dare apologize to me right now. Just tell me where it hurts." "Shoulder. And my head some. I think I hit it on the way down." Her breath hitched. "I was so afraid, Silas. I called for you and no one answered, and I thought I might die out here, and you'd never even know where to look." "I would have looked till I found you," he said, fierce, something raw and unguarded, breaking through the careful composure he'd worn like armor since the day she'd stepped off that train. "You hear me, Nora? I would have torn this whole mountain apart with my bare hands before I stopped looking." She stared up at him, shivering pale, and something in his face in that moment, stripped bare of every careful wall he'd built since Mary, since the boy, since a lifetime of loss that had taught him never to want anything too badly, told her with more certainty than any letter ever could have, exactly how much she had come to matter to him. "The shoulder's dislocated, not broken, best I can tell," he said, forcing his voice back toward steadiness. "I'm going to have to set it before we move you. It's going to hurt like hell for a second. You trust me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, and meant it more fully than she had meant anything in a very long while. The pain when it came was blinding, a white screaming flash that tore a cry from her throat before Silas's arms caught her, steadied her, held her through the worst of it, with a gentleness that seemed impossible in hands so scarred and rough. "Good," he murmured against her hair once the worst had passed, and she sagged, gasping against his chest. "You did good. Real good." Getting her back up the slope in failing light with one arm strapped tight against her body, and the temperature dropping fast enough to numb fingers, tested every ounce of strength and skill Silas possessed. And more than once, Nora felt certain neither of them would make it back to level ground before full dark swallowed the mountain whole. But he did not falter, did not so much as pause, though she could see the strain of it etched deep in every line of his face, could feel the tremor of exhausted muscle in the arm that held her steady against each treacherous step. "Talk to me," he said when they were perhaps halfway up, his voice tight with effort. "Stay awake. Talk to me about anything. Boston, your father's ledgers, anything." "Why?" "Because a woman who took a blow to the head oughtn't go quiet on a man trying to get her home safe. Talk." So she talked, disjointed, exhausted, half the words slurring together, about her father's shipping office, about the sound Boston Harbor made at dawn, about a year of letters that had promised her gentleness and delivered instead something far more real and far harder won. "I fell in love with the wrong parts of you first," she admitted somewhere near the top of the climb, delirious enough with cold and pain that honesty came easier than it might have otherwise. The pretty words, Hannah's words. "But I think I'm falling in love with the true parts now. The parts that climb down a mountain in the dark for me." Silas went very still for one step, then two, before forcing himself back into motion. "Don't say things like that," he said, rough. "Not now. Not while you're hurt and not thinking straight." "Why not?" "Because I want it to be true too badly, to trust it coming from a woman half out of her senses with pain." His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead on the trail. "You say it again once you're warm and healed and thinking clear, Nora Kane. Then I'll believe it." They reached the ranch house well past dark, and Amos, who had ridden back hours earlier to fetch help, and found none close enough to matter. In time, very nearly wept with relief at the sight of them coming up the yard. Silas half carrying Nora, the last stretch, both of them filthy and exhausted beyond words. "Get the fire built up," Silas ordered, voice cracking with fatigue. "And fetch every blanket in this house. She's been out in that cold near 4 hours. The next hours passed in a blur for Nora Amos boiling water, Silas working with a competence that spoke of years spent patching wounds too far from any doctor to wait for one. Warm compresses against her battered shoulder broth, forced past her chattering teeth. Blankets piled thick enough to finally gradually ease the deep bone cold that had settled into her during those long hours alone on the mountainside. Through all of it, Silas did not leave her side. "You should sleep," she murmured sometime near midnight, watching him sit vigil in the chair beside her bed, his own exhaustion plain in the hollows beneath his eyes. "Not yet." "Silas, I watched an empty saddle come back without you on it once today, Nora. I ain't in any hurry to close my eyes and risk missing something going wrong while I'm not watching." His voice had gone rough, unguarded, in a way she hadn't heard from him, even in the raw honesty of the mountainside. "So no, I ain't sleeping yet. Not till I know you're steady." Good. She woke past dawn to find him still there, asleep upright in the chair. His hand, she realized, slowly gently resting over hers where it lay atop the blanket, like he'd fallen asleep, holding on to her, without quite meaning to let go, even in unconsciousness. She did not move, did not want to disturb whatever fragile peace had finally allowed him rest. But the peace did not last long. Amos's voice, urgent from downstairs, jerked Silas awake instantly, hand going instinctively for a rifle that wasn't there. "Silas Ryder coming up the road fast." He was on his feet and moving before Nora had fully processed the words, and she forced herself upright, despite the protest of her injured shoulder dread, pooling cold and immediate in her stomach. Not Sloane. Not this soon. Not while she was still too weak to stand fully on her own. But when Silas returned moments later, his face had gone bloodless, in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion, and everything to do with the folded paper clutched in his hand. "Silas." Nora's voice shook. "What is it?" "Notice," he said, voice flat with barely controlled fury. "From the county. Formal notice of foreclosure proceedings filed this morning on grounds of unpaid taxes and disputed boundary claims." His hand crushed the paper slightly before he forced himself to loosen his grip. "Sloane didn't wait for Hobbs's report, Nora. He went around it, filed the claim himself direct to the judge while we were up on that mountain fighting to survive the night." "Can he do that legally?" "He's already done it." Silas's jaw was tight enough to ache. "Hearing set for 6 days from now. County courthouse. If we can't prove that survey was falsified and that payment was stolen before then, with proof solid enough to convince a judge Sloane's likely bought and paid for—" He didn't finish. Didn't need to. 6 days to save everything he'd spent his whole life building. 6 days with his wife barely able to stand no solid proof yet beyond a suspicious stake and a column of numbers that a clever lawyer could argue away as simple bookkeeping error. Nora forced herself upright further, ignoring the fierce protest of her shoulder, something hard and determined settling into her spine despite the pain still radiating through her body. "Then we have 6 days, she said, "to find proof strong enough to bury him. And I intend to spend every hour of it doing exactly that, Silas Kane, whether my shoulder likes it or not." He looked at her bruised, exhausted, barely a day removed from nearly dying alone on a mountainside, and something in his face cracked open with an emotion too large and too raw to name yet. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met in my life," he said, voice thick. "I've been told." "I mean it as a compliment," he said, and reached for her good hand, holding it like something precious he had very nearly lost and did not intend to risk losing again. 6 days. We'll find it. Together. Outside the mountain stood silent and indifferent under a cold morning sky, keeping whatever secrets it still held about stolen water and falsified stakes, and a man desperate enough to burn a fence line and dislodge a woman from a mountain path rather than lose whatever twisted claim he believed he was owed. 6 days. And somewhere in town, Barnaby Sloane was already counting them down, with a confidence Nora intended with everything still left in her battered and unbroken body to prove entirely catastrophically misplaced. The 6 days that followed passed like a held breath. Nora worked through the pain in her shoulder, because sitting still felt more dangerous than moving. Did every idle hour was an hour Sloane spent tightening whatever noose he'd built around Silas's claim. She spread the ledgers across the kitchen table each morning, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, cross-referencing every payment, every date, every discrepancy against the county's public tax rolls that Hannah, bless her, had ridden into town twice to copy by hand. Here. Nora tapped a column on the third morning, voice sharp with discovery. Silas, look at this. The deposit into Sloane's land office account, March the 9th. Your missing payment was recorded as received March the 11th, 2 days later, in a different clerk's hand entirely than the rest of the ledger. Silas leaned over her shoulder, studying the numbers like they might rearrange themselves into something less damning. Different hand meaning what? Meaning Pruitt didn't write that entry. Someone else did. Someone who had access to that book after hours when Pruitt wasn't looking. Nora's pulse quickened. If we can prove someone besides the clerk had access to falsify entries, Sloane's got a man on the inside. Amos, listening from the doorway, said it flat like he'd suspected as much for longer than he'd let on. Ain't the first time I heard whispers of it. Young fellow works nights sometimes cleaning the offices. Name of Ellis Dunmore. Owes Sloane money on a bad debt from 2 winters back. Nora and Silas exchanged a look. Ellis Dunmore, Silas repeated slow like he was turning the name over for weak spots. You think he'd talk? I think a man drowning in debt to Barnaby Sloane, Amos said, might find it real appealing to owe somebody else instead, especially if that somebody offered to forgive what he already owed in exchange for the truth. But they found Ellis Dunmore behind the livery stable that same afternoon, a thin, nervous young man with ink-stained fingers and the hollow, hunted look of someone who hadn't slept easy in longer than he cared to admit. I don't know what you're talking about, he said the moment Silas approached, backing up a step before he'd even heard the question. I got nothing to say to you, Kane. Didn't ask you anything yet, Silas said, keeping his voice low level. Nora had coached him the night before. Let me talk first. You look too much like a man fixing to hit somebody, and to his credit, he held himself back, jaw tight, but hands loose at his sides. Just want a minute of your time, Mr. Dunmore, that's all. I know you're frightened, Nora said, gently stepping forward before Ellis could bolt. I know exactly what kind of man Barnaby Sloane is, and I know exactly what kind of hold he has over people who owe him money they can't pay. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer you a way out. Ellis's eyes darted between them, calculating, terrified. A way out to what? My husband will pay off whatever debt you owe Sloane, Nora said, in exchange for the truth about what happened to a payment made this past March and about who altered the survey markers on our eastern boundary. In writing, signed, ready to be presented before a judge. You don't understand what he'll do to me if he finds out I talked. I understand precisely what he intends to do to my husband if you don't, Nora said, steel creeping into her voice despite its gentleness. A foreclosure. A family's entire life's work stolen through forged paperwork and stolen tax payments. You have a choice here, Mr. Dunmore. Stay silent and remain in that man's debt forever, watching him use you again and again for whatever scheme suits him next. Or tell the truth, once be free of him entirely, and sleep easy for the first time in longer than I suspect you can remember. Ellis's throat worked. His hands, Nora noticed, were shaking. He'll ruin me, he whispered. He already has, Silas said, quiet, not unkind. Difference is, right now you're ruined and still owing him. This way, at least you're ruined and free. Long silence. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went quiet. I need it in writing, Ellis said finally, voice cracking. The debt forgiveness, before I say one word. Done, Silas said without hesitation. Hannah can draw the paper up tonight. Ellis Dunmore's confession, once it finally came, exceeded even Nora's most hopeful expectations. He'd been paid. He admitted handshaking so badly the pen scratched unevenly across the page to alter 3 entries in the county ledger over the past 8 months, diverting payments from the Kane account into a shell account Sloane controlled through a cousin in the territorial capital. He'd also been paid separately to accompany Hobbs's assistant surveyor on the night before the official survey and move 2 boundary stakes roughly 40 feet west enough to shift the water source onto Sloane's claimed portion of the line, without appearing obviously altered to anyone who didn't know precisely where the original markers had stood for 2 generations. He said nobody'd ever check that close. Ellis said, voice thin with shame. Said the Kane place was too small for anybody to bother fighting a survey filed proper through the county. Said... He hesitated. Said what? Nora pressed gently. Said a man alone out there, no family, no fight left in him, since he buried his wife and boy. Said a man like that wouldn't have the heart left to contest it, even if he noticed. Ellis wouldn't meet Silas's eyes. I'm sorry, Mr. Kane. I truly am. I needed the money too bad to think on what it had cost you. Silas's jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides, and for one long moment, Nora feared the fury she'd seen flash in him after the fire might finally break loose here in front of a boy barely into manhood, who'd been as trapped by Sloane's schemes as anyone. But he only exhaled slow and controlled and extended his hand. Obliged to you, he said rough. Took more courage than you know saying this out loud. Ellis stared at the offered hand like he hadn't expected mercy, then took it, eyes bright with unshed tears. The written confession notarized the following morning by a traveling circuit clerk. Hannah, tracked down through sheer force of will, became the cornerstone of everything they built over the remaining days before the hearing. But Nora had known since the moment she'd first spotted that mismatched deposit in Sloane's account that a single confession from a frightened, indebted young man could be dismissed by a clever lawyer as coerced, unreliable, the desperate lie of someone bought twice over. They needed more. They needed something Sloane himself could not explain away. The account? She said on the 4th night, staring at the ledgers spread across the table until the numbers blurred. If Ellis diverted the payment into Sloane's shell account through his cousin, there has to be a paper trail on the other end too. A withdrawal. Something showing the money moved from that account into Sloane's own pocket, not just sitting untouched as some innocent misunderstanding. Bank in the territorial capital, Silas said. 2 days ride. Then we ride 2 days. Nora, your shoulder is healing. I can sit a wagon well enough. Silas, and this cannot wait for it to heal fully. We have 2 days left after the ride there and back if we leave at first light. He studied her, weighing the risk, and she watched him arrive slower than she might have liked, but arrive nonetheless at the same conclusion she'd already reached. Amos stays, he said. Watches the ranch in case Sloane tries something else while we're gone. You and I ride for the capital at dawn. The bank clerk in the territorial capital was thankfully a far more principled man than Pruitt had proven to be, an older gentleman named Whitcomb, who listened to their story with a deepening frown, and upon reviewing the account records under the authority of the notarized confession, Nora produced went pale himself at what he found. This account, he said slowly, shows 6 withdrawals over the past 8 months, each one made in person, each one signed. He turned the ledger toward them, tapping a line of careful, distinctive handwriting. Signed by a Mr. Barnaby Sloane, authorized as executor of the account under his cousin's power of attorney. Nora's breath caught. There it was, Sloane's own signature, his own hand, undeniable proof that he had personally withdrawn funds from an account fed by fraudulently diverted tax payments. May we have a certified copy of this record? She asked, voice steady, despite the triumph roaring through her chest. Given what you've shown me, Whitcomb said grimly, I'll have it prepared within the hour. And Mrs. Kane, for what it's worth, I've had my own suspicions about certain accounts moving through this branch for some time now. I'm glad someone finally had the nerve to chase them down. They rode back through the second night exhausted, saddle-sore, but carrying in Silas's coat pocket a certified bank record that would, Nora was certain, end Barnaby Sloane's scheme entirely, provided they reached the courthouse in time, and provided the judge proved as principled as Whitcomb had been. Somewhere past midnight, with the horses walking slow and tired beneath a wide field of stars, neither of them had energy left to fully appreciate. Silas broke the long silence between them. I never said thank you, he said. Proper, I mean, for all of this. The ledgers, the ride near, breaking your shoulder, trying to keep me from losing everything my father and his father built. You don't need to thank me, Silas. I do, though. His voice had gone quiet, unguarded, in the particular way she'd come to recognize only surfaced when exhaustion stripped away whatever careful walls he kept up during daylight hours. I spent 10 years up on that mountain, telling myself I didn't need anybody. Told myself that after Mary, after the boy, that wanting somebody again was just asking the world for another chance to take something from me. He paused, hands loose on the reins, eyes fixed somewhere past the horizon. Then a woman got off a train, looking like she wanted to get right back on it, and inside a month, she's fighting fires, and reading ledgers, and riding 2 days to a bank to save a ranch. She's got no real reason to care about saving. Yai, I have every reason to care about it, Nora said softly. It's my home now, too. Is it? He turned to look at her, then something raw and searching in his face. Truly. Or is it just the place you happened to land when the alternative was worse? The question hung heavy in the cold night air, and Nora understood with sudden clarity that this was not an idle question, that everything he'd guarded so carefully since that first night at the train platform had narrowed down to this single moment, this single answer, and that he needed the truth of it more than he needed almost anything else in the world. I told you once on the mountain when I was too hurt and too frightened to lie, even if I'd wanted to, she said, that I was falling in love with the true parts of you. The parts that climbed down a cliff face in the dark for me. The parts that forgave a frightened boy's debt rather than see him ruined further. The parts that have spent 10 years grieving so hard you forgot how to believe anyone might choose to stay. She reached across the small distance between their horses, found his hand in the dark. That wasn't the head injury talking, Silas. That was the truest thing I've said since I stepped off that train. I choose this. I choose you. Not because the alternative was worse. Because you are the best man I have ever known, and I very nearly missed knowing you at all because I judged you too quickly on a train platform for not smiling wide enough to suit my expectations. Silas said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone thick rough with an emotion he did not bother trying to hide. I love you, he said, plain and unadorned. No borrowed words, no careful letters. Nothing but the raw truth of a man who had finally found something worth risking his heart over again. Been afraid to say it. Afraid saying it out loud might be enough to make the world decide to take you too. But I love you, Nora Kane. However this hearing goes. Whatever we've got left or lose. That much I know for certain. Nora felt tears rise hot and sudden, and did not try to stop them. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have since the mountainside. Maybe before. They rode the rest of the way home hand in hand, exhausted and aching and entirely finally unafraid. The hearing was set for 10 o'clock the following morning, and the courthouse, a modest brick building at the center of town, had never in Nora's brief time in the territory looked so thoroughly intimidating. Sloan arrived flanked by a lawyer in a fine gray suit, composed and confident, greeting the judge with an easy familiarity that made Nora's stomach twist with worry. Judge Harmon was an older man, silver-haired, with the weathered patience of someone who had heard 1,000 disputes over land and water in this territory, and grown wary of trusting either side too quickly. Mr. Sloan brings a filed and recorded survey, Judge Harmon said once the proceedings had opened, along with tax records indicating delinquency on the Kane account. Mr. Kane, I understand you dispute both claims. I'll hear your evidence. Silas's lawyer, a earnest young man named Tobias Reed, the only attorney in the county willing to take the case against a man as powerful as Sloan Rose with the certified bank record, and Ellis Dunmore's notarized confession in hand. Your Honor, we submit into evidence a sworn notarized confession from Mr. Ellis Dunmore, employed as a night clerk in the county records office, detailing his role under payment from Mr. Sloan in altering the eastern boundary survey and diverting tax payments from the Kane account into a shell account controlled by Mr. Sloan's cousin. Sloan's lawyer was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. The testimony of a debtor coerced through debt forgiveness holds questionable reliability at best. Noted, Judge Harmon said. Continue, Mr. Reed. We further submit, Reed continued unbothered, a certified bank record from the territorial capital showing 6 withdrawals from the account in question over the past 8 months, each personally signed by Mr. Barnaby Sloane. He handed the document to the judge, and Nora watched, heart hammering so loud she was certain the whole courtroom could hear it as Judge Harmon's expression shifted from careful neutrality to something considerably harder as he stuttered. "Mr. Sloane." The judge's voice had gone cold. "Would you care to explain your signature on withdrawals from an account fed by tax payments that should have gone to the county on Mr. Kane's behalf?" Sloane's composure, for the first time since Nora had met him, finally cracked in full view of witnesses who mattered. "Your Honor, He glanced at his lawyer, who looked equally blindsided. "That account belongs to my cousin. I had authority to manage certain transactions on his behalf. That's all it doesn't mean. It means," Judge Harmon said, "that money belonging to the county paid by Mr. Kane in good faith ended up in your personal control through withdrawals bearing your own signature." "That is not a misunderstanding, Mr. Sloane. That is theft compounded by fraud, compounded further by a falsified survey that this court now has substantial cause to believe was altered at your direction using a debtor of yours as instrument." The courtroom had gone utterly silent. "Your Honor," Sloane's lawyer began, "my client—" "Your client," Judge Harmon interrupted sharp, "will remain seated while I finish. I am dismissing the foreclosure proceedings against Mr. Kane in full effective immediately and restoring the original boundary line as recorded prior to the falsified survey. Furthermore, given the evidence presented today, I am referring this matter to the territorial prosecutor for criminal investigation into fraud, theft, and falsification of county records. Mr. Sloane, I would strongly advise retaining separate criminal counsel because the civil matter before this court today is very much the least of your concerns going forward." Sloane sat frozen, face drained of all its practiced smoothness, staring at the documents on the table, like they might somehow rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic if he looked hard enough. Beside Nora, Silas exhaled one long, shuddering breath, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. "It's over," he whispered, hardly believing it himself. "Nora, it's actually over." She gripped his hand tight enough to ache, tears spilling freely now, not caring who saw. "It's over," she agreed. Sloane did not go quietly. Outside the courthouse, as the small crowd that had gathered to witness the proceedings began to disperse, he caught Silas's arm, a last desperate, undignified grasp at whatever power he still believed he held. "This isn't finished," he hissed, low, venomous. "You think a county judge and a scared clerk's confession ends this? I have friends in the territorial capital, Kane. Money enough to make this go away entirely if I choose to spend it. Maybe?" Silas said, calm now, in a way that unsettled Sloane far more than anger would have. "Or maybe you spend the next year of your life explaining to a prosecutor why your signature's on withdrawals fed by stolen tax money. Either way, Sloane, you're done pretending to be somebody in this town. Everybody standing right here just watched you unmasked for exactly what you are. You think that woman actually loves you?" Sloane's composure finally shattered, entirely ugly and desperate. "You think a woman like that, educated, refined, actually chose a dirt-poor mountain rancher who can barely write his own name? She stayed for the fight, Kane. The moment the fight's done, she'll realize what she actually married, and she'll—" "That's enough." Nora's voice cut through sharp and absolute, stepping forward to stand directly between the two men. "Mr. Sloane, I have watched you falsify surveys, steal tax payments, burn a fence line, and very nearly cost me my life on a mountainside, all because a woman chose another man over you decades ago, and you never found the grace to let that bitterness go. I do not need you to validate my marriage. I do not need your permission to love my husband, who has shown me more honesty, more courage, and more genuine tenderness in 6 weeks than you have shown this entire town in the years you've spent grinding good people beneath your boot for profit. Go home, Mr. Sloane. Prepare whatever defense you intend to mount, and pray for your own sake that the territorial prosecutor proves more merciful than you have ever been to anyone standing in your way." Sloane stared at her, something in his face finally fully collapsing the recognition. Perhaps that whatever he had believed himself to be in this town had ended decisively and publicly on this courthouse step. He said nothing further. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away. And Nora understood, watching him go, that whatever remained of Barnaby Sloane's power in this territory had just ridden off with him, diminished beyond any hope of recovery. They rode home slower than they'd ridden anywhere in the past 6 days. No urgency left to drive them. Only the wide settling relief of a fight finally truly won. Amos met them in the yard, and the moment he read the outcome in their faces, he let out a whoop loud enough to send the barn cats scattering, and even Hannah, who had ridden out with her boy to wait for news, burst into tears of relief right there in the dust. "It's done," Silas told them, voice still faintly disbelieving. "Ranch is ours. Boundaries restored. Sloane's finished near as the law can finish him." "Lord," Amos breathed, dragging a hand across his face. "Thought sure we'd lose it all there for a spell." "Would have," Silas admitted, glancing at Nora with something warm and unguarded in his eyes. "If not for a woman stubborn enough to march into a county clerk's office and demand answers, nobody else had the nerve to ask for." That evening, supper stretched long and easy, full of relieved laughter and Amos's stories, and Hannah's boy, falling asleep, sticky-fingered, against his mother's shoulder. And Nora sat through all of it, with a fullness in her chest she hadn't known in longer than she could remember. Not since before her father's death. Not since before every careful, guarded year that had led her eventually to a train platform and a stranger who did not smile easily. Later. Once the house had gone quiet and Amos had retired to the bunkhouse, Silas found her on the porch, watching the stars spread thick and bright over the mountain ridge. "Told you the mountains would turn gold in the evening," he said, settling beside her. "First letter I ever wrote you. Well, first letter Hannah ever helped me write." "I remember," Nora said, leaning into his shoulder. "I read that line so many times the ink wore thin. Didn't believe it myself half the time I wrote it," he admitted. 10 years up here alone, a man starts to forget what beauty even looks like if there's nobody left to share the sight with." He turned to look at her, something soft and certain in his weathered face. "Not anymore, though." She reached up, touched the scar along his jaw, that no letter had ever mentioned the one she'd noticed that first terrifying, uncertain moment on the platform, and had come in the weeks since to see not as a mark of hardness, but as a record of survival of everything he'd endured and carried, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, still found room in his heart to share with a stranger who'd nearly run from him twice over. "I almost got back on that train," she admitted quietly. "That first day, I had my hand on the rail, ready to beg the conductor to take me home." "I know," Silas said. "Saw it in your face plain as anything. What made you say what you said? I won't blame you if you want to go back. You could have tried to convince me. Most men would have." He was quiet a moment, considering. "Figured a woman worth having wasn't a woman you talked into staying. She was a woman who chose to stay on her own once she'd seen the whole truth of what she was choosing." His hand found hers in the dark. "Glad you chose it, Nora. Gladder than I got words for borrowed or my own." "So am I," she whispered, and let him pull her close. The fear and fire and fury of the past 6 days finally fully settling into something steady and warm and entirely unshakably real. Above them, the mountain stars kept their slow, indifferent turn, and somewhere down in the valley, the lights of the town they'd both nearly lost everything to save flickered small and distant against the vast healing dark. A home no longer threatened a marriage, no longer built on borrowed words alone, and a love that had, against every fearful expectation either of them had carried onto that train platform 6 short weeks before, finally fully arrived. 3 weeks after the hearing, word came that Barnaby Sloane had been formally indicted by the territorial prosecutor on charges of fraud, theft of public funds, and falsification of county records. Silas read the notice twice before he set it down on the kitchen table, and Nora watched something in his shoulders loosen that had been tight, she realized now, for far longer than the 6 days of their fight against Sloane tight. Perhaps since the day he'd buried Mary and the boy, and decided the world owed him nothing further, and he'd expect nothing further from it. "Trials set for spring," he said. "Territorial capital. Prosecutor says with Ellis's confession, And the bank records, it's about as clean a case as he's seen in years. Will you have to testify? Both of us, most likely. He looked up at her, something wry tugging at the corner of his mouth. You nervous? Not particularly. Set a plate of biscuits between them, sitting across from him at the same table where 6 weeks ago she'd first laid out his disastrous ledgers and demanded he let her help. I rather enjoyed watching him unravel in front of Judge Harmon. I imagine I'll enjoy it a second time in front of a jury. Silas laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she'd heard from him only a handful of times since the train platform, and each time it struck her fresh, like discovering some rare bird had chosen against all odds to nest on land. Everyone else had written off as too harsh to sustain anything worth keeping. The town's opinion of them, Nora noticed over those following weeks, had shifted in ways both large and small. Louisa Fitch, who had once needled her about Silas's disordered ledgers with such thin-cutting satisfaction, now greeted her outside the mercantile with an entirely different tone. Mrs. Kane, a careful smile uncertain of its welcome. I heard the news about the hearing. I confess I never imagined Mr. Sloane capable of such things. Didn't you? Nora asked, mild, though she made no effort to soften the edge beneath it. I understood a great many people in this town suspected considerably more than they ever said aloud. Louisa's smile faltered. I suppose some of us were simply too frightened to speak against a man with his money and his connections. I understand fear, Mrs. Fitch. I do not begrudge anyone for it. Nora softened slightly, remembering her own fear on that first terrible night, the shaking hand on the train rail. But I hope going forward this town finds a little more courage when it matters. My husband deserved better than years of quiet whispers, while a man robbed him blind in broad daylight. You're right, Louisa said, and to her credit, seemed to mean it. For what it's worth, Mrs. Kane, you've done this town more good in 2 months than most folks manage in a lifetime. I hope you know that. Nora hadn't expected the words to land as warmly as they did. Amos took ill in late autumn. Nothing serious, the doctor assured them after riding out from town, only a hard chest cold that laid him low for the better part of a week. But the sight of the old man pale and weak in his bunkhouse bed shook Silas more visibly than Nora had expected. He's not as young as he used to be, Silas admitted one evening, sitting at Amos's bedside, long after the old man had drifted into exhausted sleep. Don't rightly know what I'll do when the day comes. He can't work the ranch alongside me anymore. That day isn't today, Nora said gently, resting a hand on his shoulder. And when it comes, you won't face it alone. You have me now, Silas, whatever comes. He looked up at her, something achingly grateful in his tired eyes. Don't know how I managed 10 years without you, he admitted. Feels strange now, remembering how empty this place used to sit of an evening. Amos recovered within the fortnight, gruff and irritable about having been fussed over, but the moment had settled something further between Nora and Silas, a quiet, unspoken understanding that they had become in the truest sense a family bound by more than paper and proxy vows, exchanged a continent apart. Hannah arrived one crisp morning in early winter with news that set the whole household buzzing. Ellis Dunmore's leaving the territory, she announced, settling at the kitchen table, while her boy ran off toward the barn, cat that had by now grudgingly accepted his affections. Heading east, taking a position with a printing house his uncle runs. Says he wants a fresh start somewhere. Nobody knows what he did for Sloane. Good for him, Silas said, and meant it. Boy paid enough for his mistake, way I see it. Deserves the chance to build something better elsewhere. He asked me to pass along his thanks, Hannah said, glancing at Nora. Said if not for your kindness that day behind the livery, he'd likely still be trapped under Sloane's thumb, doing whatever fresh cruelty the man dreamed up next. Nora felt a quiet swell of satisfaction at that, not triumph over Sloane exactly, but something gentler. The knowledge that even amid a fight built on fraud and fire and fear, some genuine good had managed to take root and grow. The trial, when spring finally arrived, proved every bit as damning as the prosecutor had promised. Nora and Silas rode to the territorial capital together, testifying before a courtroom considerably larger and more formal than Judge Harmon's modest chambers. And Nora watched Barnaby Sloane sit through 3 days of testimony, with his composure crumbling further with each new piece of evidence laid before the jury. Ellis's confession, the bank records bearing his own signature testimony from Whitcomb, the bank clerk even damningly, testimony from 2 other ranchers in the territory who came forward once word spread that someone had finally found the courage to challenge Sloane's schemes, each with their own quieter stories of disputed boundaries and mysteriously delayed tax payments that had until now gone unchallenged, for fear of exactly the kind of ruin Sloane had nearly visited upon the Kane Ranch. "Turns out," Silas murmured to her during a recess, watching 2 more witnesses whisper together outside the courtroom, clearly building courage to add their own testimony. "We weren't the only ones he'd been squeezing, just the only ones fool enough or brave enough, I suppose, to fight back." "Both, perhaps," Nora said. "Sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference until after the fighting's done." The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. Guilty on every charge. Sentencing set for 8 years in the territorial penitentiary with restitution ordered to every rancher whose claims had been proven falsified or whose payments had been diverted through his schemes. Sloane did not look at either of them as he was led from the courtroom in shackles, his fine coat replaced already with plain prison gray, his easy honeyed confidence entirely permanently extinguished. "It's really over," Nora breathed, gripping Silas's hand tight as the courtroom emptied around them. "Truly, finally over." "Truly over," Silas agreed, and pulled her close right there in the crowded courthouse hallway, uncaring of who might see, and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of every fear finally fully laid to rest. They returned home to a ranch transformed not by any dramatic change in the land itself, but by something deeper, something Nora had watched take root slowly over the many months since that terrifying first evening on the train platform. The herd had grown careful breeding and honest bookkeeping, finally allowing the ranch to turn its first real profit in years. The fences stood true and mended, the water ran clean and undisputed through land that had belonged to Silas's family for 2 generations and would, God willing, belong to their children after them. Amos had recovered fully from his winter illness, gruffer and more stubborn than ever, though Nora noticed he'd begun teaching young Ellis's replacement, a boy from town eager to learn ranch work, with a patience that suggested he'd started quietly planning for a future beyond his own working years. And Nora herself had changed too, in ways she recognized only when she caught her reflection some mornings and found staring back at her a woman entirely unlike the frightened, uncertain bride who had once gripped a train rail so tightly her knuckles had gone white with the effort of not fleeing. "You've gone quiet," Silas said one evening, finding her on the porch where she so often sat, now watching the mountains catch the last gold light of day, exactly as his very first letter had promised her they would. "Just thinking," she said, "how strange it is looking back. That first night I stood right where you're standing now and wondered if I'd made the worst mistake of my life. And now," she turned to him, reaching for his hand, drawing him down beside her, "now I wonder how I ever could have doubted it. This is the truest thing I have ever chosen, Silas Kane. Truer than anything I left behind in Boston. Truer than anything I imagined those letters promising me." He was quiet a long moment, something working behind his weathered face that told her he was building toward words that did not come easily to him. Even now, even after everything they'd survived together. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "that our marriage started awful strange. Proxy vows judge in Boston, a stranger's signature standing in for mine. Never did feel entirely real to me, if I'm honest. Not the way I always imagined a marriage ought to feel." Nora's chest tightened, uncertain where this was headed. "Silas, I want to marry you proper." He said the words coming faster now, like once he'd started, he couldn't stop them. "Here, this land, in front of Amos and Hannah and her boy and whatever's left of this town, willing to stand witness. I want to say vows to your face, Nora, not have some cousin standing in for me 1,000 miles away. I want the whole territory to see me choose you plain and certain, the way I should have had the chance to choose you from the very start." Tears rose hot and sudden, and Nora didn't bother fighting them. Yes, she said before he'd even finished asking. Yes, Silas. 1,000 times yes. They married again on a warm June morning, exactly 1 year to the day since Silas had first sat down with Hannah's careful hand to write the very first letter that would eventually bring a frightened, hopeful stranger across 1,100 miles to a train platform nearly sent her running straight back home. The whole town turned out even Louisa Fitch, who brought a pie and an apology in the same breath, and Judge Harmon himself, who rode out specially to officiate declaring it, he said one of the finer occasions his office had afforded him in years. Nora wore a simple dress, nothing like the fine Boston gowns she'd once imagined marrying in, and found she did not mind at all standing there in the mountain sunlight with wildflowers woven through hair that had over the past year grown accustomed to wind and work in ways her younger self would scarcely have recognized. Silas stood before her in a new shirt Hannah had sewn for the occasion, his weathered face open and unguarded in a way she still even now found herself faintly astonished by this quiet, careful man who had once seemed to her nothing but hard edges and silence, revealed now after everything they'd weathered together as the gentlest heart she had ever known. Silas Kane. Judge Harmon began. Do you take this woman? I do, Silas said, before the judge had even finished the question, drawing a warm ripple of laughter from the gathered crowd. Been waiting the better part of a year to say it proper. Ain't waiting 1 second longer than I have to. Nora laughed through her tears, and when her turn came, she answered with equal certainty, equal fullness of heart. No hesitation left in her at all. None of the frightened uncertainty that had gripped her that first terrible night. Only the settled, unshakable knowledge that she had found at the very edge of a wilderness she'd once feared might swallow her whole. Exactly the home and exactly the man she had been searching for without ever quite knowing it. That autumn, Nora discovered she was carrying their first child, and the news, when she finally worked up the courage to tell him, brought Silas Kane, this quiet, weathered mountain man who had faced down fire and fraud and a falling woman on a treacherous cliffside without once losing his composure, to actual unguarded tears. A baby, he said, voice cracking, hands trembling as he pressed them gently against her still flat stomach like he could scarcely believe what she'd told him. Nora, a baby. Are you happy? She asked, though she could see plainly that he was wanted only to hear him say it. Happier than I got words for, he admitted, resting his forehead against hers. Borrowed or my own. Happier than I ever let myself believe I'd be again after Mary, after the boy. Thought that door closed forever. Thought I didn't deserve it to open again. You deserved it all along, Nora said fiercely, cupping his face in her hands. You deserved joy long before I ever stepped off that train, Silas. I only wish someone had told you sooner. Somebody did, he said, voice thick. Took her 1,100 miles and a whole lot of stubbornness to finally get here and say it. But she did. The child, a daughter born the following spring during a gentle rain that Amos declared with great solemnity the finest kind of omen a mountain ranch could hope for, arrived healthy and loud and utterly beloved, and they named her Mary Hannah Kane, honoring both the wife Silas had lost and the sister-in-law whose careful hand had, however unconventionally, helped bring Nora into his life in the first place. Hannah wept at the honor. Amos declared himself an uncle in all but blood and spoiled the child shamelessly from her very first week. And the town, the same town that had once whispered pity and mockery at a mail-order bride nearly running back onto her train, now gathered eagerly for every small celebration the Kane Ranch offered, welcoming at long last both Nora and the family she had helped build with the same warmth they might have offered any woman born and raised among them. But young. Years later, when their daughter was old enough to ask about how her parents had first met Nora, would tell her the story slowly, honestly, leaving nothing softened or hidden. I nearly got back on that train, she'd say, settling little Mary onto her lap by the fire, while Silas listened from his chair, the same quiet smile he always wore during this telling tugging at the corner of his mouth. I stood on that platform terrified, certain I'd made the worst mistake of my life. Your father was nothing like the man I'd imagined from his letters, rougher, quieter, a stranger in every way that frightened me. Then what happened? Mary would ask every time, though she'd heard the answer 100 times before. "Then I stayed," Nora would say, reaching for Silas's hand across the small distance between them, finding it exactly where it always was, exactly where it had been for years now, steady and certain, and entirely permanently hers. Because sometimes, the truest love isn't the one that arrives wrapped in pretty words and easy smiles. Sometimes it arrives covered in dust, wearing worn boots, asking nothing more than one simple, terrifying question. Will you stay long enough to find out what's really underneath the silence? And if you're brave enough to answer yes, you might just find the truest, deepest love of your entire life, waiting patiently on the other side of your fear. Silas would lean over then every single time and press a kiss to the crown of their daughter's head, and another softer still to Nora's temple, and the fire would crackle warm against the mountain night outside, and the ranch that had very nearly been stolen from them by greed and fraud would stand instead as testament to everything they had fought together to protect and to build. A home earned through honesty, a love proven through fire and falsified surveys, and a desperate climb down a mountainside in failing light. A family forged not from the easy comfort of certainty, but from the harder, truer courage of two wounded people choosing again and again to trust each other completely, even when trust had once seemed like the most dangerous risk either of them could ever take. And on the mountain above their home, the same gold evening light that had once filled a lonely rancher's very first letter still fell each evening exactly as he had promised it would, gilding the ridgeline, warming the valley, illuminating a life neither of them had dared hope for on the terrifying, uncertain day it had all begun. They had built something no fraud, no fire, no bitter and grasping man could ever take from them. They had built a home, and it was at long last entirely unshakably theirs.